Welcome to yet another session of digital photography. In this session, we shall be discussing history of photography. The word photography comes originally from two Greek words, which means light drawing. Light is at the heart of photography from initial exposure to the final image. Photography is both an art and a science. As an art, it expresses a personal vision, and as a science, it relies on technology. This dual nature is unique to photography. The main difference between photography and more traditional art such as painting is its dependency on technology. A photograph is not just a representation of what one sees in reality. It makes visible something that is not seen by an ordinary observer. A photograph is definitely worth 1,000 words. And it has the power to convey a whole new meaning. While photography may be a hobby to some, for others it is a complete profession offering various avenues. Photography was born of two separate developments, one in chemistry and the other in optics. In this session, we will discuss the history of photography. Now on to historical background. Photography evolved over several years and was much like a jigsaw puzzle. One man would make a small discovery and another man years later would build upon that discovery. We'll come to the camera. There is no way of knowing who constructed the first camera, or as it is called in Latin, the camera obscura. The principle was known to the Arabian scholar Ibn al-Haytham before 1038 AD. In its basic form, the camera obscura was a dark chamber or room. Light passed through a small hole at one end of the room and formed an image on the opposite wall. This image was not sharp, as no lenses was attached to the opening in the wall. The smaller the hole, the sharper the image was. In 1558, Giovanni Battista della Porta was the first to suggest the camera obscura be used as a guide for drawing. The application of lenses to camera obscuras by 1550 increased both the sharpness and brightness of the image and led to further investigations into the design and construction of camera obscuras. As more people became interested in them, the size of the camera obscuras shrunk until they became extremely portable by comparison and could be used by more people as a help in rendering perspective correctly. In 1676, the first reflex camera appeared, one in which the image is reflected onto a top-mounted viewing screen by an inclined mirror behind the lens. All the artist has to do was put a piece of tracing paper on the top of the viewing screen and trace the outline. Thus, the camera became part of the artist's tools. Next, we'll discuss what is photographic chemistry. Photographic chemistry came rather late in the long history of the development of the camera. It refers to the invention of a light-sensitive material, an emulsion. The first important discovery was made by Johann Heinrich Schultz, a professor of anatomy at the University of Altdorf near Nuremberg. In 1725, Schultz saturated chalk with nitric acid that contained some silver. Exposing this mixture to the sun, Schultz was amazed to discover that the mixture facing the sun turned dark violet, while the portion turned away from the sun remained white. At first, he believed that the darkening was due to the mixture of chalk and nitric acid. Sometime later, he remembered that the mixture had contained silver as well as chalk and nitric acid. He realized that it was the silver and nitric acid that caused the darkening by the light. Thus, silver nitrate was discovered to be reacting to light. What is a permanent image? The next important discovery was made by the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele. Scheele confirmed one of Schultz's discoveries that the blackening effect of the silver salts was due to light and not to heat. To prove this, he spread the white compound on paper and exposed it to the sun for 2 weeks, during which the paper turned completely black. He then poured ammonia on the powder and discovered that the blackened silver was metallic silver and had become insoluble in ammonia. That is, the ammonia did not dissolve the exposed silver. The ammonia, in other words, acted as a fixer. Scheele did not realize the importance of this discovery, the ability to make a photographic image permanent. Nor did Scheele conceive the idea of photography, an honor reserved for Englishman Thomas Wedgwood. Around 1800, Thomas Wedgwood made the first attempt to capture an image in a camera obscura by means of a light-sensitive substance. He used paper or white leather treated with silver nitrate. Although he succeeded in capturing the shadows of objects placed on the surface in direct sunlight and even made shadow copies of paintings on glass, it was reported in 1802 that the images formed by means of a camera obscura have been found to be too faint to produce in a moderate time an effect upon the nitrate of silver. The shadow images eventually darkened and none of it survived today. The earliest known permanent camera image done from nature was made by a Frenchman, Joseph Nicephore Niepce, in 1826. The culmination of an experiment begun 10 years earlier, it began the long history of contributions to the development of photography by artists, as Niepce was by trade a lithographer. Niepce, using paper coated with silver chloride, succeeded in photographing the picture formed in a small camera, but the photographs were negatives, darkest where the image was lightest and vice versa, and they were not permanent in the sense of being reasonably light sensitive like the earlier experimenters. Niepce could not find a way to prevent the coating from darkening when it was exposed to light for viewing. In heliography, Niepce did not set out to make a photograph. He set out to make a photolithograph, trying to reproduce copies of drawings and paintings, which he succeeded in doing in 1822. He called his process heliography or sun writing. In 1826, Niepce succeeded in making the first permanent photograph from nature using a camera obscura. The heliograph was made on a pewter plate, and it took 8 hours for the image to be recorded. In that same year, Niepce made contact with the Parisian painter Louis-Jacques Mandet Daguerre, and they formed a partnership in 1829. It, however, did not produce any noticeable improvement in making photography practicable. In 1833, Niepce, the inventor of photography, died. Daguerre made photography practical. He improved the process so much that he felt justified in naming the product the daguerreotype. Now, what is daguerreotype? The process of daguerre was as follows. A sheet of copper was placed with silver, the silver surface being well cleaned and highly polished. The silver surface was exposed in a small box to iodine vapor until the surface was golden yellow. The sensitized surface was then placed in a camera obscura, where it remained for 5 or 6 minutes. It was then taken from the camera and developed in a vapor derived from mercury. Then the plate was washed and dried, after which it was placed in a case with a sheet of glass over the daguerreotype to protect its surface, as it is very easy to rub the image off the plate. A well-exposed daguerreotype is possibly the most beautiful form of photography. It processes brilliance because of the silver surface and shows every detail far better than any modern paper print. Of course, there are some outstanding defects in a daguerreotype. The image can be seen only when it is held in a certain position. Otherwise, it simply reflects light over its surface because of its mirror-like quality. Another defect of the daguerreotype was that only one copy of the image could be made from each exposure. Even with these defects, the daguerreotype was the most important photographic process for more than 15 years, and especially in America where many improvements were made. The most important improvement was the shorter exposure time it took to make the image. At first, the exposure time needed to make a daguerreotype was 5 to 20 minutes. Too long to make portraits feasible, but by the end of 1840, several Americans had made significant improvements so that the exposure time was cut to a few seconds. This, of course, made portraits possible, and by 1841, the first chain of portrait galleries was opened by John Plumb. There were also men who taught the art of daguerreotype, the most notable of whom was Samuel F.B. Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, who had met Daguerre in Paris while demonstrating his invention. The earliest daguerreotype known to exist is by the inventor of the process, Louis Daguerre. The exposure was probably several minutes long, much less than the 8-hour required by Niepce's heliograph. The enthusiastic reception of Daguerre's process extended to poetry. Light is its silent artist, which, without the aid of man, designs on silver bright, Daguerre's immortal plan. Niagara Falls was already a world-famous tourist attraction when Platt Babbitt made this daguerreotype about in 1855. It was in America that daguerreotype reached the height of its popularity. Millions of Americans, famous and obscure, had their portraits made. Although the exposure time was reduced to less than a minute, it was still long enough to demand a quiet dignity on the part of the subject. This portrait, taken by an itinerant daguerreotypist, is the only known photograph of the 19th century poet Emily Dickinson. Just like her poems, it seems directly on the surface but elusive on more intimate levels. Dickinson later described herself as small like the wren, and my hair is bold like the chestnut burr, and my eyes like the sherry in the glass that the guest leaves. Next we come to the Calotype. Men from all corners of the world praised Daguerre and his wonderful invention, never mentioning Niepce as the true inventor. Yet there was one man who heard the news with dismay. An English country gentleman, William Henry Fox Talbot, saw Daguerre's method as a threat to his own process, the Calotype, or as it was known later, the Talbotype. Talbot began his experiment in 1834 after returning from a trip to Italy, where he drew landscapes. His first successful image, made in 1835, were of leaves and lace laid down on sensitized paper and fixed in salt water, which was also Daguerre's first method. These are negative images on paper, today referred to as photograms. Talbot made very little progress in the next 3 years because his attention was diverted to other matters. It was not until he received news of the impending announcement of Daguerre's method that he sought his place of honor. His action from then on appear not to be those of an English gentleman. Less than 2 weeks after the French government released the news of the daguerreotype, Talbot visited John Frederick William Herschel, a prominent mathematician, astronomer and chemist who was interested in photography from a chemist's point of view. Herschel was a generous man, and when Talbot visited him, he described in detail a chemical he had invented which he called hyposulfite of soda. This chemical is still in use today, known as fixer. It makes photographic negatives and prints permanent. Talbot, on the other hand, revealed nothing of his process. He immediately put Herschel's hypo to use. And when Talbot wrote to the French government of his method, Daguerre immediately applied it to his own process. Herschel not only discovered fixer, he coined the word photography, which comes from the Greek words meaning light writing. Herschel used the term to differentiate between Talbot's negative paper prints and Daguerre's positive image method that used copper plates. The Calotype process could not compete with daguerreotype for several reasons. But perhaps the worst stumbling block in its evolution was Talbot himself, who patented the process and its improvement and sold them upon receipt of a large amount of money. However, Talbot must receive the credit for inventing the photographic process we use today, that is, the negative-positive relationship. In 1847, 8 years after Dagger and Talbot made public their discoveries, and 14 years after Joseph Niepce died, a cousin of the latter, Abel Niepce de Saint Victor, invented a process for sensitizing a glass plate with an emulsion of silver iodide and fresh whipped egg white, or albumen we call. The mixture was not very sensitive to light, but it was capable of rendering fine detail and good tone, which the Calotype negative was unable to do. Talbot patented a slight modification of this albumen on glass process in 1849. Even though this method used a glass negative instead of, as with Talbot's Calotype, a negative made of paper. Next, we will move on to the WET-COLLODIN process. Another and more important invention was made by an English sculptor, Frederick Scott Archer. Archer learned the Calotype process in 1847 and decided to improve it. In March of 1851, he gave the word the WET-COLLODIN, but the advantage of the WET-COLLODIN process was difficult to obtain. A glass plate had to be cleaned, after which iodized collodion was poured on the plate, which was then immersed in a silver nitrate bath and put into the camera while still wet. Development had to be performed before the plate dried, and because of this, it became known as the wet plate process. Again, Talbot claimed that the wet plate process was an infringement upon his patented Calotype, and he prosecuted anyone who didn't buy a license from him to use it. Finally, in December 1854, the courts found Talbot's claim illegal and released the process. By 1858, the daguerreotype was being replaced by WET-COLLODIN process. One variation of this process was known as ambrotype, which was less difficult to make than daguerreotype. An ambrotype is an underexposed WET-COLLODIN negative on glass. When the ambrotype is mounted against a black backing, it appears less positive. Ambrotypes didn't match the tonal range of a daguerreotype. However, because they were quicker to make, they became very popular. But like the daguerreotype, ambrotypes couldn't be duplicated, so copies couldn't be made. The tintype was variant of the ambrotype. Originally called a ferrotype or melanotype, they produced positive image, usually on a thin sheet of iron, though some were made on leather and other materials. Tintypes were cheaper and easier to make than ambrotypes, and they were unbreakable. However, they lacked the tonal range of an ambrotype. The tintypes were made by millions up to modern types. Another type that was popular in 1850s along with ambrotype was a carte de visite, a photographic visiting card. The fad began in France but soon was found almost everywhere. Small photographs the size of a business card with a portrait or scene mounted to a cardboard backing. They were made by using a wet plate negative, and thus any number of prints could be made. Because of this, they were cheap and their popularity was enormous. By 1860, with ambrotypes, tintype and carte de visite being made at the same time, the daguerreotype became a dead art. Some of the activities at Talbot's establishment in Reading near London are shown in this early Calotype taken in two parts and pieced together. At left, an assistant copies a painting. In the center, possibly Talbot himself prepares a camera to take a portrait. At the right, the technician at the racks makes contact prints and another assistant photographs a statue. At the far right, the kneeling man holds a target for the maker of this photograph to focus on. The prints for the first book to be illustrated with photographs, The Pencil of Nature, were made at reading. In a notice to the reader, Talbot gave his assurance that the plates of the present work are impressed by the agency of light alone, without any aid whatever from the artist's pencil. They are the sun pictures themselves, and not, as some persons have imagined, engravings in imitations. This is Hunter and His Dog. Half-plate ambrotype by unknown American photographer. Next we come to the Kodak. By 1880, the wet plate became dry, and thus a picture could be exposed and then developed weeks later. An amateur photographer of this period, George Eastman, became interested in the manufacture of dry plates. In December 1880, the Anthony Company, it's known as GAF or GAF, it began the sale of the Eastman's dry plates. But some people began to dream of a flexible film. On September 4th, 1888, Eastman patented a camera which was loaded with a roll of flexible film capable of 100 exposures. The camera sold for $25 and its slogan was, "You press the button, we do the rest." It was named the Kodak. When 100 pictures were taken, the camera was mailed to the company, where for $10 the film was removed and processed. Prints were made, fresh film was reloaded, and the camera was returned to the sender with the finished prints. The idea caught on, and in no time, Kodak was a household name. Photography was now in the reach of everyone. Next we come to the development of color process. Color had been the dream of photographers since the medium of photography was invented. The foundation for color photography had been established in 1859 by James Clerk Maxwell, a Scottish physicist who demonstrated that all colors could be reduced to combinations of 3 primary colors. Many attempts were made to apply this principle to photography. But it was not until many decades later that inventors were successful. The first commercial color film, Autochrome, hit the market in 1907. Autochrome produced transparencies, or slides they were known as, that could be enlarged very much without showing the grain of the starch dyes that were used to create the image. It also took 50 times as long to expose as black and white film. The Lumiere brothers made the first successful color glass plates for commercial use in 1907. Menz and Kitarsky in Kodak Laboratories introduced the first color roll film, Kodachrome, in 1935. Kodak Color was introduced in 1941 for making color prints. Now we'll analyze the technical developments. The inventor Barnack was responsible for the pioneer 35mm camera, the Leica, in 1924. Though not quite as simple to use as the earlier Kodak model, it was technically more sophisticated and quite a bit smaller. As a result, amateur photography became an international passion. Other technical advances continued to appear all the time. Continual improvement over the years established the 35mm camera, especially in its single lens reflex or SLR form. It became the dominant camera for both professionals and serious amateurs. Let's see how the photography in India came about. Photography was first introduced in India in 1840. Only a year after the announcement of the daguerreotype and calotype processes in France and England. This happened mainly due to the enthusiasm of the colonial powers. Despite lack of speedy transport and communications, equipment for photography was made available in India as early as the 1850s. Initially, commercial studios were established in cities such as Calcutta, where an ever-increasing clientele could be relied upon to keep up a demand for portraits. The history of Indian photography is closely linked with the history of India itself. In fact, the powerful role of the camera as an authentic recorder of events came into force in India when those with access to camera went about documenting the freedom movement. The tragedy of partition, the anguish of India soon after Gandhiji's assassination and Jawaharlal Nehru's address to the stunned crowd in front of the Birla House in New Delhi have all been immortalized by the photographs taken by the veteran photographer Henry Cartier-Bresson. In the beginning, the Indian photographers unknowingly did the job of photojournalists. They called themselves artist photographers. Among the earliest photographers to take to this medium seriously was Maharaja Swami Ram Singh II of Jaipur. Some amateurs also brought cameras to India. Some of the earliest surviving photographs from India are in a family album, now in the Getty Museum, containing views taken in Nainital, Bareilly and Kanpur during the mid-1840s. Around the same time, the French daguerreotypist Jules Itier, he was born in 1802 and lived up to 1877, he passed through India whilst engaged in a treaty negotiation with China. A handful of his views of South India still survive today in a number of collections. The extremely small amount of material that has survived from the 1840s represent only a fraction of the photographic activity that took place during the period. After 1850, with the use of the camera spreading across the subcontinent, things got a lot more popular. During this time, in 1854, Bombay Photographic Society was formed with 200 members. Similar bodies were also formed in Madras and Calcutta in 1856, tied to the colonial regime. The East India Company declared photography to be the most accurate and economical means of recording the architectural and archaeological monuments for official records. The company actively encouraged its employees to photograph and record archaeological sites. Thus, it was due to this that photography became a key element of the Archaeological Survey of India, which was established in 1861. Now let's look at Indian photographers. By 1863, a number of Indian photographers had also set up their photographic establishments in the major cities of British India. They came to operate successfully in competition with foreigners. Their British counterparts conceded the high quality of their work. Of all the Indian photographers, the name of Lala Deen Dayal stands out as a bright star. He was the one Indian photographer who not only stood on par with European photographers but also outclassed many of them. European photographers were soon joined by Indians, at first amateurs who turned professionals later. Among the amateur members who made a name were Dr. Bahu Daji, Ardasi Kursadji and Dr. Narayan Daji in Mumbai, Rajendralal Mitra in Bengal and C. Liaswamy in Chennai. In UP, Ahmad Ali Khan, who did free photography, had left 2 albums of portraits of the period just before the mutiny. Daroga Haji Abbas Ali was another. He produced the Lucknow album as also an illustrated album of the Rajas and Talukdars of Oudh in 1880. Initially, there were just a handful of photographers devoted to press photography in India. It was only after the country became independent that the demand for photographs of topical interest showed an upward trend. The Press Information Bureau, a central agency of the Government of India, arranged photo coverage of government activities, which were then supplied to dailies and periodicals all over the country to enable them to supplement written coverage by pictures. But not many photographs taken during this time got into print. In the 1950s, news photographs meant only to cover official functions. Photojournalism in its true sense made its impact in India only in the 1960s. The Illustrated Weekly of India was a pioneer in using photography as a means of communication and encouraging photographers to take to photojournalism. On 2 occasions, the Press Institute of India, in collaboration with the Photo Division of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting and Land and Life of Calcutta, exhibited the world press photographs in Delhi. It is worth recalling in this context that a photo feature by an Indian, which was an entry at the Press Institute's contest, gained the top award at the World Press Contest. Apart from this, many independent news agencies then came up, which dealt primarily with photographs. These photo syndicates had photographers around the world and supplied photographs taken by these photographers to their subscribers. In India, PTI started its photo service in October 1987. It had an arrangement with AP through which AP photographs were distributed to subscribers of PTI's photo service. The history of photography in India over the last quarter of a century has been told largely from the perspective of a handful of colonial collections, in particular the India Office collection, now housed at the British Library in London. Publications by British library curators including Ray Desmond's Victorian India in Focus, that is in London, and it was taken in 1982, and John Falconer's A Shifting Focus, Photography in India, ranging from the year 1850 to 1900, which is housed in London from 1995. Have been influential in establishing significant photographers and events while emphasizing the importance of British documentation work. Now we come to photography in the digital era. Although the digital camera was not available to consumers until 1990, the most important technology behind digital cameras, the CCD or charge coupled device, was invented in 1969. CCD is an image sensor which allows for direct conversion of images into digital data without a chemical process. In the beginning, the technology was mostly applied to video cameras for use in television broadcasts. In 1981, Sony came out with a prototype digital camera which could take still images and store them on a floppy disk. Over the next 10 years, companies like Logitech and Kodak worked on their own models. Single lens reflex camera is now replaced with DSLR, digital single lens reflex camera. The main difference between the two being the use of digital technology instead of film rolls. Photos on digital cameras are typically compressed using the JPEG standard and stored on memory cards. The popularity of digital cameras exploded in 2000s as technology improved and the cost of production decreased. Modern digital cameras produce detailed photos made up of a large number of pixels. The technology behind cameras is improving all the time, with additions such as touchscreens and electronic viewfinders. Photography has now become a powerful means of communication and a mode of visual expression that touches human life in many ways. For example, photography has become popular as a means of crystallizing memories. Most of the billions of photographs taken today are snapshots, casual records to document personal events such as vacations, birthdays, and weddings. Photographs are used extensively by newspapers, magazines, books, television, and internet to convey information and advertise products and services. Practical applications of photography are found in nearly every human endeavor, from astronomy to medical diagnosis to industrial quality control. Photography extends human vision into the realm of objects that are invisible because they are too small or too distant, or events that occur too rapidly for the naked eye to detect. A camera can be used in locations too dangerous for humans. Photographs can also be objects of art that explore the human condition and provide aesthetic pleasure. For millions of people, photography is a satisfying hobby and a rewarding career. The latest of happenings in photography is the second digital revolution. The first one made a switch from film to digital sensors, and the second one put cameras in mobile phones, shirt pockets, and even ladies' handbags. This second one vastly expands the aesthetic possibilities for photographers. It allows to do things that the painters never had any difficulty with, but where the photographers were seriously limited by the capacity of their lenses and the constraints of the photographic film. And as always been the case with photography, it opens up areas that are close to painters. Part of this revolution is printing materials and techniques enabling production of images for display vastly superior in quality to anything that has ever come out of the darkroom. Now, let us have a quick look at what we have discussed in this session. In this unit, the focus was to familiarize with the history of photography. From the Chinese who knew the theory of light to the invention of camera obscura, silver nitrate, daguerreotype and calotype. The step-by-step evolution of modern world's best art and technique was made possible by contributions of a number of committed inventors over several decades. The chapter also deals with the evolution of cameras in digital era. While the first digital revolution made people to switch from film to digital sensors, the second one put cameras in mobile phones, shirt pockets and even ladies' handbags. The latest of the happenings in photography, the second digital revolution, is vastly improving the aesthetic possibilities available to photographers and makes everybody a photographer as envisioned first by George Eastman. Before we attend the next session, please try to answer the following questions. What are the main differences between heliography and daguerreotype process in photography? Briefly explain how photography came to India. How is history of photography in India connected with the country's history? Write an essay on the evolution of the photographic process, starting with the camera obscura to the digital camera. Here are some books for your reference. Complete Digital Photography, Practical Tips on Technique, Printing and Presentation, written by Tom Ang, is brought out by New Holland Publishers in London. The Manual of Photography, 10th edition, written by Elizabeth Allen and Sophie, brought out by Taylor and Francis in 2009 and published in New York. Handbook of Photography, 5th edition, published by James Falls et al. And published by Delmer. With that, we come to the end of the session. I hope this was useful for you. So till we meet again, it's a goodbye from all of us here.